Welcome to Know Your Rights New Jersey. I'm your host, Reinhold Ponder. On today's show, we're going to discuss a variety of issues around immigration, including extreme vetting, Daca, also known as the DREAM Act, and some orders and positions of the federal government which are designed to keep certain people out of this country. With us today is our returning guest to help us understand some of the issues around individual rights in these challenging times. And with us is a preeminent international immigration attorney and educator, David Nachman. Hi,
Thanks
David.
so much.
Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Well, it's been about a year, and a lot has changed since you were last with us. The environment, not only a new president, but apparently a new international and national identity. Help us by starting us out with a general idea of what this confusion is. Make it as simple as possible for us. What's going on?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride since we've last been together.
Yes.
And obviously we had a couple of projections. Some of those projections were clearly not on the mark. And I think that everyone was a little shocked about the way that the new administration took the country by storm. And with regard to immigration, it's a brave new world for us. It's been a roller coaster ride since the end of January when the president was inaugurated. 1 week later, he put into place a travel ban, a Muslim travel ban. So-called Muslim travel ban was actually a travel ban which was against 7 countries. As you know, that was one of the executive orders.
And now since it's gone through the courts, it's been reduced to 6, I understand.
Exactly. Well, the first executive order, which was on January 27th, was restrained in its totality.
Yeah.
Then there was an immediate second executive order that came into place, which is, you're absolutely right, was 6 countries. They took Iraq off. And remember that this was a temporary ban. This was only supposed to be for 90 days.
Well, I was going to ask you later, but since you mentioned that, since the ban was in place, or since the orders, hasn't that period that was indicated in the bans, I believe 6 months, hasn't it not passed, but hasn't it moved forward? And
exactly, and that's really interesting because then what we have is supposedly, and of course it's yet to be seen, but they have it slotted for an argument before the Supreme Court in October. And I guess one of the arguments is going to be mootness. Because, right, so that's going to be one of the arguments before the Supreme Court is, well, the 90 days are gone, so what's the point? But I think that it really boils down to an issue of presidential power.
Right.
And when he passed that executive order, what he was doing is he wanted to show that the president's right and ability to stand for national security was more important than the constitutional rights of the people or the rights of the people who were coming to the United States. And yeah.
Well, and still on the ban, what is the signal that the Supreme Court is now sending after overruling orders from Hawaii and I don't recall the other state.
Right. So it was actually I believe it was Maryland and Hawaii.
That's right.
It was Maryland and Hawaii.
Yeah.
So the way that it shakes out right now, where we are today, is that they had opened up. They said the ban will be in place. However, what they did is they loosened it to many exceptions. And so, in fact, what I do is I went through the exceptions. I just have a couple of notes here. Obviously, green card holders are an exception. Approved refugees are an exception. Visa holders are an exception. And then the interesting thing that they dealt with over the summer, I believe it was in July, the Supreme Court addressed individuals who have bona fide relationships to the United States. And that's really interesting because doesn't that open an interesting can of worms?
And did not define what bona fide was.
And left it to the courts. So what ended up happening is that things like immediate familial relationships were dealt with, or relationships with entities, okay, so that was okay. So basically parents, children, siblings, spouses, fiancés, parents-in-law, children-in-law, and then there was this issue with grandparents, which I thought was really interesting because it's like, how can you say that a grandparent is not, is not a familial relationship, or is not a relationship or tie? So that was interesting that they wrestled with. But initially, uncles, cousins, nieces, and nephews were not sufficient, but now they are. So that's where they are right now.
And were fiancés were also excluded, I believe, were they?
I think they were included originally, but it could be that it was later put in.
Okay.
Again, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, to say the least.
Right.
And just keeping up on what the courts are coming out with on a day-to-day basis is really difficult for us.
So on this particular issue, give us a little bit of what you think the Supreme Court might do in the end, if you can call it end.
Yeah, I kind of had a feeling you were going to go there. So,
like a sports show, make a prediction.
yeah. Last time you asked me for the prediction, I wasn't exactly right. So I don't know if I'm really comfortable making the prediction. But again, I think what it's going to come down to again is it's going to be a very delicate balance, and it's going to be a very delicate balance between the president's power, of course, or the rights of individuals to enter the United States, as to whether or not this is an issue of religious discrimination. Because if you take a look, of course, at the countries that are being addressed, they are all Muslim countries. And if you take a look at the tweets that the president has put out, unfortunately, he's sort of led. He's put out evidence, okay, I think that leads to the potential for a colorable argument of discriminatory intent. And that puts him into a very difficult position. So I think that, as you know, with any judicial branch, it's about weighing and balancing. And they're going to have to come up with some way to decide what is the limit of presidential power, with regard to the security issues. I think that if you take a look around the world and we continue to see these terroristic activities, I think that weighs heavily in the direction that the Supreme Court might go. I think that they may, and it's highly likely that that they may say that the president, the executive, has the power to make determinations like this. I think, however, what they could do is also say, notwithstanding that determination, we feel that the issue that was originally brought forth is moot, and therefore we don't need to address it. So that might be the way that they do it.
Okay,
so we're the Supreme Court's a very interesting place. They could send a message and yet not make a determination that really means a whole lot within the realm of what the case was originally. So we'll have to see what shakes out.
Okay, so the travel ban is one of several issues. So what else is going on?
Well, the very, very hot issue, which you and I have been discussing, of course, is Daca. And I think that we discussed it in the last time we got together. We were talking about Daca, but I think that we were talking about it in the realm of DACA expansion. We were talking about DACA 2, I believe, and I think we were also talking about DAPA.
That's right.
And the ability. So, as you know, I think it was what happened in Texas was that Judge Hainan had filed a restraining order against the DAPA program, and DAPA was restrained. DACA 2 never went into effect. And now what's interesting is, of course, the president has altogether taken DACA 1 out of commission. It's basically rescinded. So anyone who has DACA now has until October 5th to file an extension, and they will probably still get 2 years of work authorization. But then the question becomes, what happens from there? And that's a really good question. So This basically this program affects 800,000 people.
Right.
The studies out there say that it affects potentially for our GNP close to $4 billion in monies that these individuals will be paying in taxes, and also in contributions that they're going to be making to Social Security.
So it would be very destructive to our economy, according to some reports.
Exactly.
Right.
So this seems to be what they're saying, and I just I'm going to give you sort of a personal thing.
Please.
Is that we had a DACA person. She came into our office and we applied for DACA, and I saw she was a very, very talented individual,
Right.
and we hired her. And she was working for us for a long time. She's now moved on to another place of employment, but she worked for us for a long time. I can say, as personally seeing these DACA people, they want to make a life here in the United States.
Well,
they were not okay.
Remind us what a DACA person is.
Okay, so a DACA person is an individual who was brought to the United States prior to the age of 16, who was not brought here by choice. Usually, it was their parents who were undocumented. They were brought to the United States, and then it was President Obama who issued what's called an executive action, and that's also something very interesting because and the media tends to get it a little wrong, and it's a little frustrating for me when I hear and I see in the media how they're discussing it, because they talk about it as an executive order, which DACA was not. See, President Obama did something. First of all, President Obama was brilliant with the way he did DACA. What he did was he vetted DACA through all of the and he's a constitutional law professor himself.
Right.
So he vetted through all of his appropriate staff and all the appropriate methodologies that DACA was permissible because it was a logical extension of what we call is deferred action.
Right.
Okay, deferred action. So it's a deferred action type of program. It's been around for years and years and never questioned. Its constitutionality has never been questioned. And it was actually a logical extension first by Julie Myers, who was in charge of the Immigration Customs Enforcement. What she did was she issued a memorandum which said that what we're going to do is we're going to take a no action position with regard to individuals who fall into certain categories. And then a couple of years later, John Morton was in charge of the Immigration Customs Enforcement, and he did the same. But he honed that a little more. And part of one of those categories where we're not going to remove people were the dreamers.
Right.
And then what President Obama did was he just took a logical next step there and said, we're going to allow the dreamers to stay. He basically set forth certain criteria. And for example, they had to be before the age of 16. There were certain dates in place when they had to enter the United States and be physically present. And so that was DACA 1. And that opened up basically the ability for these 800,000 people to get work authorization in the U.S.
So what you're telling us is that the suggestion by Sessions and President Trump that this was illegal is inaccurate.
So again, very interesting. So President Trump, he keeps referring to it as an executive order that President Obama passed, but it wasn't an executive order. Okay, again, it was an executive action.
Right.
And then he basically took it offline. So it does say in the memo, the original DACA memo, that they do have the ability not to renew. And so he took the memo off, so basically what he's doing is he's rescinding the memo. But then the question is he in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act? Because President Trump, and actually and this was going back to when DACA was passed, everyone said, oh, well, President Obama is exceeding the ability that he has under the law. He's making executive orders. He's just basically making it up as he goes. But that's not really what happened. But that's what everyone alleges, okay? But here's the thing is the argument then against what he did was, well, he should have put it in front of Congress, and Congress should have passed a law. And then that law should have been signed by the president. And that would have been the proper way to do it. So now we're 180 degrees where President Trump has taken it offline, and everyone's saying, well, no, in order to take it offline, you have to do the same. You have to go and you have to follow the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, and you have to also give notice, rulemaking, and then you can take it offline. So that's the argument. It's very interesting.
So before we go to break and discuss specific individual rights, I want you to tell us a little bit about the issues of the court's position on extreme vetting. What is happening in that regard?
Okay, so well, actually, the way, and again, as you know, when the president came in, he issued an executive order, and subsumed within that executive order is what's called extreme vetting. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to make sure that people's cases are properly, that the background checks are done properly. And extreme vetting in this environment is taking a couple of different forms. One of the forms that it's taking is what's called administrative processing, and we're dealing with that at the U.S. consulate offices abroad, where they're doing background checks, heavy background checks on everyone, and what it's doing is it's holding up like crazy, holding up cases for a long period of time.
Did they set a number of days? Did they set a number of interviews per day that really slows it down?
Yeah, they have a capitation requirement. Yes. Whenever we go to the consulate and we meet with consular officers, they always talk about capitation, and they're always talking about how many cases they get through. What they don't tell you, of course, is how many cases end up in administrative processing. So we get calls as immigration lawyers from individuals who have been to the consulate, given them all the information, and the case goes into what's called 221G administrative processing. So those administrative processing holds have been very frustrating for us, for our clients. Lots of students coming to the United States from Princeton, all over the country, who unfortunately their cases are being held at the U.S. consulate. It's very difficult. So yeah, so they're having trouble making their start dates appropriately. The other thing is now the announcement was made a couple of weeks ago that every single case now is going to be interviewed in the United States. So whereas for many years we didn't have to worry about employment-based cases being interviewed, now they're going to interview every single case, which means family-based cases and employment-based cases are going to be interviewed at the district offices, which means that basically the ripple effect of that is that we're going to have severe backlogs, wait times, and much more frustrated clients, unfortunately.
There's a lot going on, and thank you for breaking it down that way. Yeah. What we'll do, we'll take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk more about the specific rights and things that people, our viewers, need to know in order to exercise those rights in this very challenging time. We're back with David Nachman, and we're discussing immigration. David, there's so much going on, but there must be something that we're missing and that the press is missing. What is the subterfuge? What is actually happening?
So I'm glad you asked, because I think that this is something that gets by a lot of folks. And a lot of folks didn't really comb through the executive orders. That's my job. I have to read through it, and believe me, it's a bit of a snoozer, especially the first one, when I read through it, and then all of a sudden it ended up getting restrained, so then we were back into reading the second one, which is not that much different, but it's strangely what lies in those executive orders, and it's not even between the lines, it is blatant, is a complete restructuring of the national security system. And I think that that goes to this whole 90-day travel ban, because what I think that if you remember the discussions about the need for the temporary travel ban was so that the government could put into place a vetting system that would work. Now, obviously, this is the 90 days is all gone, and it's interesting because all the people who are being asked in court about why they need this 90 days, they're all saying, they say, well, you know, have you done the vetting? And the answer of all the lawyers for the government is no, because we've been in court arguing these cases, so we haven't had time to do the vetting. So, but what's interesting is it's almost like what happened in 2001 under the USA Patriot Act, which was passed right after 9/11. So the government tends to be extremely reactive, and I think that in light of all of these terroristic activities abroad here in the United States over the course of years has forced us now to be proactive, and the proactivity has to do with this provision that's subsumed in the executive order, where what they're going to do is they're going to reorganize the national security system and reconnect databases. And we're starting to find that and we tell our clients this every day, the databases are getting better and better.
So what does that mean for us practically, that these databases are getting better and better?
So maybe back in the day where you would think that information was not necessarily getting to the desks of the adjudicating officers at the USCIS when cases were being done. For example, let's say an individual had entered the United States unlawfully, was stopped at the border and gave a false name, and the fingerprints were taken. That information was not readily available. Now that information becomes much more readily available to the desks of the adjudicating officers. And then you start to see there's a section of the law called 212A9 3, and 212A9-3 is a permanent bar. And if the individual has re-entered the United States after departing, they are permanently barred. And so we're finding more and more cases coming under this permanent bar.
So are you telling us that basically there's becoming a consolidation of information on individuals under these orders?
Right. So I think what I'm saying is that I don't know if I'd call it a consolidation as much as I would say that there's much more interconnectivity. And I think that, Donald Trump, he is a businessman. And as a business person, and as you know, being in business, I know being in business, that there is value to having resources within your organization communicate. And communication is important. And I think one of the things that, as much as the things that he does are extremely frustrating, he is bringing communication to the government and forcing communication among these different security organizations. And there's I think there's a clearer sharing of resources, and there is value to, and I believe you would agree with me, that there's value to having security information being shared among organizations that are enforcement agencies, so that if we do have a threat, potentially, that we would be able to identify that threat before it becomes a reality.
But for many people out here, that seems to be more of a cover for some other nefarious ends. And whether it is or not, there are a lot of people out here who are afraid to leave their homes, to execute their public lives, to go to school, to go to restaurants, to wash their clothes, to drive.
Absolutely.
What can you say to them, whatever law or order impacts them, about how they can conduct themselves and protect themselves in this challenging period?
So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that it has really become a time of fear for especially people, and the folks, the parents of Dacians.
Let's talk about them.
Yeah,
yes, let's talk about.
This is problematic, and I think that what we're the first and most important thing that we're telling folks is, number one, seek good legal counsel. Because a lot of times, and I believe I may have said this last time we were together, is that a lot of people don't realize that there may be options that are available to them. They may be out of status here in the US, but there are options for people who are out of status here. For example, I think we may have talked about it last time, is there's something called the U visa. The U visa is for an individual who's entered the United States, even if it's without inspection, who's a victim of a certain crime. And the government allows them to work with a law enforcement agency to be able to get a visa, and they can stay. And that's allowed. It's called a U visa. There's also something called 245I. The 245I program was spearheaded by President Clinton's administration. It was a sunset back in April 30th of 2001. And if you did a qualifying filing before the government on April 30th of 2001, you're allowed to adjust your status and stay here. The military parole program is still in place. So if you have an individual in the family who was in the military, if it's a direct relative, you can file for parole in place. And so there's also deferred action, which is that thing we talked about before that, again, is what Daca DACA finds its roots in the concept of deferred action is still out there. So there are all of these programs that people can take advantage of, but they don't even know that they can.
Okay, so there are a number of options, and going to counsel is one thing, but some people might not believe they can afford counsel. They might not know what counsel they can reach. Are there organizations that can help them? Are there certain attorneys that they should go to and should avoid?
It's a great question. Thank you for taking me down that road, because of course my assumption, being an immigration lawyer, is that everyone can afford the services that our firm provides. But you're absolutely right. And that's why there are excellent NGOs that are out there in various communities.
NGOs are
non-governmental organizations that are funded, they're charitable organizations, many of them. They're funded by various large not-for-profits. Catholic Charities is one excellent organization. Many of the folks who I know have worked for Catholic Charities. There's something called ICE, which is in the Jewish community. There's something called IUTA, which is in the Spanish community. So there are all these different organizations now. And Friends, I think, is a Lutheran organization. I'm not endorsing, obviously, any of them, but I am going to say that I do have friends who work in these organizations. They're excellent lawyers, and if you cannot afford legal counsel, that's a great place to go.
Now, usually when there are great problems, there are people coming up with great solutions, but on the other hand, there are people coming up with great scams. Are there things that people should be aware of to avoid?
Another great question. So we tend to find that there are these folks out there, we refer to them generally as notarios. Notarios are individuals who are not authorized to practice law. They will help people. Unfortunately, the problem is that we tend to find that they do not know the rules well enough, and they place our clients, who they subsequently become our clients, because they're trying to undo the mess that the notarios have created. And so it makes things very difficult for us. So we always try to steer individuals in the direction of competent legal counsel over them just going to a notario and doing something which later is going to come back to haunt them. By way of an example, I met with a woman yesterday in the city, in our office in the city, and she showed me her documents, and I saw she had work authorization cards. And so what I did was I said, "How did you get that?" And so she said, "Oh, well, this person told me to file a family unity about 10 years ago." And I said, it was horrible, because what they did was they led her down the primrose path. Yes, she got work authorization, but if she had gone to her interview, she would have got immediately deported or removed. So, this is the type of thing that we deal with on a daily basis. I don't know if I'm going to be able to fix that problem for her,
right.
But the nice thing about it is it wasn't done by her lawyer. It was done by someone who said, "Oh, I'll get this for you." And so she probably didn't even know what they were doing. So I guess the bottom line here, the watchword is, don't fall into the hands of a notario who's going to make the case so much more difficult for competent legal counsel to fix. Go to someone who knows what they're doing.
So this has been great. But let's end the show with, what is the most important thing that you want our viewers who need help to know and to understand?
Also, thank you. Great question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide to you, and I hope that you can provide it to all of your viewers, is a Know Your Rights card, which is actually, I'm not going to take credit for drafting it. It was actually put out by the ACLU. And they've been putting it out. It's a little red card. We give it out to all of our clients who come in to see us who do not have status. The card gives you step by step the things that you, first of all, very important, you have rights. If you're in the United States, whether you're here legally, whether you're here without status, you still have rights. You have the right not to say anything. If you're stopped, you have the right to ask for a lawyer. And then it lists out all of your other rights on this card. I'm going to provide the cards to you, and actually you could even maybe provide it as a screenshot if you'd like.
We will.
And then that should be something that individuals carry around with them, because in the event that they're stopped, they may be nervous, they may not want to say something. All they have to do is take out this card and show it to the individual, and that says all.
Thank you, David. It's been great. Thank you very much. And
My
thank
pleasure.
you for joining us on Know Your Rights New Jersey. See you next time.
Thank you.